On November 12th, 1918, after everyone was waking up from a deep slumber, they would arise to see a world that was very different from the one just a day before. November 12th marks one day after the end of World War I, and for historical purposes, really marks the beginning date for the modern world we inhabit today. And yet, the end to all this bloodshed wasn't necessarily marked with overjoyous celebrations, not even in the victorious powers. Instead, for nearly everyone involved, the end of World War I marked a deep period of contemplation and reflection, a pivotal moment where people asked themselves what they had lost, what they had gained, and where to possibly go from here. However, for some people, a different question preoccupied their time. For many people, they asked themselves, how the heck did this war happen? How were human beings able to inflict such atrocious acts on one another over the course of 4 years? But they also asked themselves, how were people capable of getting up out of the trenches in the first place and facing the storm of steel that existed as they tried to cross no man's land, a process that would lead to almost certain death? And for those people who asked these questions, it almost universally led to a dynamic change in the way they thought and viewed the world. For one man, though, the process of asking and answering these questions would lead to him questioning whether or not his entire theory on human behavior and human relationships had been wrong. He wondered if all his research and all his efforts over the past decades had been for nothing. And for this man, who lived in a country which was a shadow of its former self now, his theories would have to undergo a substantial review and transformation. And that man is probably the most famous psychologist of all time, Sigmund Freud. And it became clear to him, at least, that there was something about human behavior, there was something about human nature that Freud had fundamentally missed in his first outing. Up until World War I, Freud had never had to live through a major war between two industrialized superpowers. There had certainly been some minor wars in his lifetime, but definitely nothing on the scale of World War I. So the psychology of warfare and how human beings would interact with warfare was something he didn't explore. He had no reason to explore. But after the devastation of World War I, Freud realized that his current theories had no way of explaining why human beings did what they did in that war. It can't be resolved simply by this id-ego, superego interaction. That while yes, the id definitely can have some violent tendencies, and yes, there are societal expectations exemplified in the superego that must be fulfilled, expectations of duty, of honor, of fighting for your country, but those shouldn't override your natural survival instincts. How did men get up out of the trenches and face certain death after watching wave after wave of their comrades get mowed down in no man's land? It just simply didn't make any sense. After some reflection, Freud certainly didn't abandon the core of his psychoanalytic ideas. What he did do was add another layer onto them. One thing Freud gets a lot of criticism for is his inflexibility in his belief in his own ideas and the infallibility of his own ideas. If we ever say that he's wrong, he can just say, "Oh, you're in denial, and that proves my point even more." Great system, right? You're always right, no matter how vehemently people deny that you're right. But I think this criticism of Freud is a little unfair, as we have an example right here where his core ideas were fundamentally shaken. And as a result, he changed and adapted his theories. So what did he do? Well, in 1920, Freud published a book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which he outlined a couple new concepts that he was bringing in to Freudian theory. And the main one, for our purposes, is a theory called the death drive. And keeping within Freudian principles, this still has to do with wish fulfillment. So at its core, the death drive is a new player. It's a new piece on the Freudian chessboard that is your unconscious mind. And this new piece opposes the sort of pleasure instincts, the life instincts, your instincts for sexual gratification, for reproduction, and so on and so forth. And what the death drive is an unconscious wish to return to the elements from which you came. As Freud puts it, a return to your inorganic chemistry. And one of the reasons he came up with this idea was because he had been working with several World War I soldiers that were continually reviving their traumatic experiences through dreams, that is, from the war. And because they were having these dreams, which were very contradictory to the pleasure principle, continually returning them to that point of pain and agony, Freud theorized this was the death drive at work. That secretly the death drive did not get its wish in the war, and it was unconsciously reminding the subject of the trauma in hopes that they would fulfill said death drive. And this death drive was in constant conflict with what Freud called the eros, which is your life force, your life drive. And going back to what we said before, those are your pleasure principles. After Freud, the death drive would be labeled Thanatos, after a Greek harbinger of death. Unfortunately, though, the death drive is not something which endures the test of time, that most people discount this idea in our modern lifetimes. But I still think it's an interesting thought, especially when you think about victims of post-traumatic stress disorder, a horrible disease, one which I hope I'm never afflicted with. But when you ask yourself, why would our unconscious mind continually relive these traumatic experiences? And when you recall that a far too often outcome of post-traumatic stress disorder is the suicide of the subject, well, I don't think it's unreasonable to hypothesize that there is some sort of unconscious death wish there, that there is some sort of unconscious want to end the suffering. Just something to consider. But now, let's take the final part of this topic to examine the legacy of Sigmund Freud and how he impacts our world today. I think the number one legacy of Sigmund Freud is that he was the first one to really hypothesize in a systematic way that human beings had more needs than just our base ones. That besides food, water, shelter, human beings needed safety, they needed friendship, they needed love, and with that, sex. And if we are to suppress and ignore these needs, well, it will have disastrous consequences for the mental health of the individual, and by extension, the mental health of society. That we have to come together and recognize that human beings are fundamentally flawed, and that's okay. That there are healthy ways to channel these flaws that we have into societally constructive behaviors. That through this process that Freud calls sublimation, which is another one of his psychological defenses, we can channel these impulsive and destructive urges into something truly spectacular. For example, an author can channel his violent tendencies into creating a great work of fiction. But most of all, I think Freud got us thinking about how our pleasures, how our wants, how our needs, how our drives affect our behavior. And that's something that people previously weren't thinking a lot about, and something that honestly, in our society, I don't think we do enough research on.